Eritrea, the North Korea of Africa. Man, that's a pretty heavy comparison, don't you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a bold statement for sure.
So today we are going to do a deep dive into this whole Eritrea situation.
Okay.
We're going to try and understand why people are making that comparison
Yeah.
and what it all means for Eritrea, but also, the region and the wider world.
Sounds good.
So our jumping off point today is this article from 1945 titled, Eritrea is the North Korea of Africa. America must act.
Wow.
So yeah, pretty strong stuff right off the bat.
Definitely grabs your attention.
It does. It does. So before we really get into the article itself, I think it's important to set the stage a little bit. Right. Talk about Eritrea. Like, where did they even come from?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people probably don't even know where Eritrea is on a map.
Yeah. It's one of those countries that, doesn't always make the headlines.
Right.
So Eritrea gained its independence back in 1993 after a really long and bloody war with Ethiopia.
Right. Decades-long war.
Yeah. And there was so much hope at the time, like they had this beautiful capital city, Asmara. People were really excited about their new leader, Isaias Afwerki, and they had this strategically important location on the Red Sea. It really seemed like they had everything going for them.
Yeah, it's interesting how that strategic location can be both a blessing and a curse, right?
Totally. And that's something we'll definitely come back to. But first, let's get into this whole North Korea comparison, because the article makes a pretty strong case.
Yeah.
So they basically argue that Afwerki, despite being super popular at first, ended up choosing this path of authoritarianism and economic mismanagement.
Interesting.
And they compare him to, another leader who kind of went down that same road, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I see the parallels there for sure.
Yeah.
Both came to power with so much promise, but things took a dark turn.
Exactly. So what do you think about that comparison? Is it fair to put Afwerki in the same category as Mugabe?
Well, it's complicated, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have these really horrific human rights abuses in both countries. But on the other hand, the situations are also very different. Zimbabwe had this whole land redistribution issue, which Eritrea doesn't.
Right.
And the economic situations are quite different as well. I mean, Zimbabwe went through hyperinflation, which was just devastating.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the article's point is that, economic mismanagement can create this breeding ground for authoritarianism. Right? Like, when people are struggling, they're more likely to accept a strongman leader who promises stability, even if it means giving up their freedoms.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think the border war with Ethiopia really plays into that.
Oh, absolutely. That war was brutal. The article says up to 100,000 people died.
Yeah, it was a senseless conflict over a tiny strip of land.
Yeah, and it just dragged on and on for years.
And it really seems like Afwerki used that war to consolidate his power. Rally the people against a common enemy, distract from the problems at home.
It's like that old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
And speaking of crises, let's talk about this national service program in Eritrea. Because the article compares it to, and I'm quoting here, slavery.
Yeah, that's a strong word, but honestly, it's not that far off.
Really? Is it that bad?
It's pretty horrific. Basically, every young person in Eritrea, men and women, is forced to serve in the military or do some kind of national service.
Then for how long?
Indefinitely. There's no set end date. People can be stuck in this program for years, decades even.
Oh, wow. So it's basically forced labor then?
Pretty much. They're paid next to nothing. They have no control over their lives. And if they try to escape, they're labeled as traitors.
God, that's awful. No wonder so many young Eritreans are risking their lives to flee the country.
Yeah, it's a major humanitarian crisis.
And the crazy thing is, the article says that even if they do manage to escape, Eritrea still finds ways to control them.
What do you mean?
Well, apparently Eritrean embassies around the world are being used to extort money from the diaspora.
Really? How so?
So they have this thing called a regret form that Eritreans seeking services from the embassy have to sign.
A regret form?
Yeah. Basically, they have to admit that they left the country illegally and beg for forgiveness.
Yo.
And then on top of that, they have to pay this 2% tax on their income.
2%? That's crazy.
Yeah, and it's not just on their current income. It's on everything they've earned since they left Eritrea.
So even if they escaped years ago, they still owe the government money?
Yep. It's basically a way to punish people for leaving and to keep them financially dependent on the regime.
That's messed up.
It is. And there's more. They also have to join all these different organizations that are basically arms of the ruling party.
So even if you escape the physical borders, they still find a way to control you.
Exactly. It's like this long reach of the regime that extends all over the world.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it.
It is.
Yeah.
And the article even highlights this interview with the Eritrean ambassador to South Sudan. That had to be taken down from the internet because it was so revealing.
Oh, I remember that. It was pretty shocking.
Yeah, the ambassador just came right out and admitted to all of this stuff, like it was no big deal.
Yeah, it was like a glimpse behind the curtain,
Yeah.
you know? A rare moment of honesty from a regime that's usually so secretive.
Exactly. And the fact that they tried to bury that interview makes you wonder what else they're hiding.
Right. It's like, what else are they not telling us?
Totally.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the next point the article makes, which is that Eritrea isn't just a problem for its own people, they're also becoming a destabilizing force in the region. That's a serious accusation.
It is. But the article lays out some pretty compelling evidence.
Like what?
Well, for starters, they've been getting involved in conflicts in neighboring countries like Djibouti, Sudan, and even Ethiopia.
Really? I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, it's been pretty under the radar. But apparently, they've been supplying weapons to various groups.
Yeah.
And even kidnapping people.
Wow, that's pretty serious.
It is. And the article even compares them to, North Korea sending troops to fight for Russia and Ukraine.
Oh, wow. So they're basically acting like mercenaries. Yeah, kind of. And it raises all these questions about their motives. What are they trying to achieve by getting involved in all these conflicts?
Right. It's not like they're a major military power.
Exactly. So it's got to be something else.
Maybe they're trying to position themselves as this regional power broker, like a mini Iran or something.
Maybe. But it seems like a pretty dangerous game to play.
Oh, for sure. The Horn of Africa is already a powder keg, with all the ethnic tensions and the ongoing conflicts.
Right. And if Eritrea is actively fueling those conflicts, it could have some pretty serious consequences for everyone involved.
Absolutely. It's a recipe for disaster.
So given all of this, what does the article think the U.S. should do about Eritrea? Because they definitely have some strong opinions on that.
Oh, yeah. They don't hold back.
So let's dive into that next time.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the 1945 article is calling for pretty drastic action from the U.S. They're actually suggesting regime change.
Yeah, regime change. That's a pretty big deal, right?
It is. And, we've seen how that's played out in other countries, like Iraq, for example. Not always so smoothly.
Right. It's definitely not something to be taken lightly.
So what would regime change even look like in Eritrea? I mean, are we talking about military intervention?
Well, the article doesn't explicitly say that, but they do mention supporting opposition groups like the Blue Revolution Movement, which is this group of exiled Eritrean activists.
Okay, so more like supporting the opposition from afar.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But even that is tricky. You're meddling in another country's internal affairs, which can have all sorts of unintended consequences.
Like that whole, who are we to decide what's best for another country kind of argument?
Right. And then there's the question of, okay, even if we do support regime change, what comes next? Like, what's the plan for a post-Afwerki Eritrea?
Yeah, because you don't want to just create a power vacuum.
Right.
That could lead to even more chaos and instability.
Exactly. So it's a really complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
I mean, it's easy to sit here and say, oh, yeah, the U.S. should totally get involved. But it's a lot harder when you actually have to consider all the potential consequences.
Right. And the article doesn't really address those. Like, what if things go wrong? What if the new government is even worse than the old one?
Yeah. And who ultimately pays the price for those mistakes? It's usually the people, the everyday citizens.
Exactly. So, yeah, regime change it's a big gamble with potentially huge stakes.
Okay, so maybe regime change is off the table. But the article also suggests some other measures the U.S. could take, like cracking down on those illicit activities we were talking about earlier, with the Eritrean embassies and the diaspora taxes.
Yeah, that seems like a more reasonable starting point, targeting the regime's finances without necessarily getting involved in their internal politics.
So basically hitting them where it hurts, their wallets.
Right. The article specifically mentions Himbal Bank, which is this Eritrean bank that's apparently involved in a lot of shady stuff.
So maybe sanctioning that bank.
Yeah.
Or freezing their assets.
Yeah, something like that. The idea is to cut off their financial lifeline and make it harder for them to operate.
And that could potentially put pressure on them to change their behavior?
Right. Like if they can't access their money, they might be more willing to negotiate.
Yeah. It's like, you want to play these games, fine, but it's going to cost you.
Right. But of course, sanctions can also have unintended consequences, like they can end up hurting ordinary people.
Yeah, that's always the concern. Like you're trying to punish the regime, but you end up punishing the people they're supposed to be representing.
And it can also make it harder to provide humanitarian aid.
Right. Because if you're sanctioning their banks, it becomes more difficult to get money and resources into the country.
So yeah, they're a tricky tool. You have to use them carefully.
It's like a balancing act.
Right.
You're trying to find that sweet spot where you're putting enough pressure on the regime to make them change, but not so much pressure that you're hurting the people.
Right. And there's no guarantee that sanctions will even work.
Yeah. I mean, Eritrea has already been under sanctions for years.
Yeah.
And it hasn't really changed their behavior that much.
Right. So it's not a silver bullet solution.
Okay, so we talked about regime change. We talked about sanctions. Is there anything else the article suggests?
Well, they also point out that the United Arab Emirates is partnering with Eritrea, and they're calling on the U.S. State Department to pressure the UAE to end that partnership.
The UAE. That's interesting, because aren't they a close ally of the U.S.?
Yeah, they are, which makes things even more complicating.
So it's like we're asking our friend to stop being friends with someone we don't like.
Right. And that's never an easy conversation to have.
Especially when there's a lot of money and strategic interest involved.
Exactly. So it's a delicate diplomatic dance, to say the least.
Man, this whole Eritrea situation is just, it's a mess.
It is. It really is. And it just highlights how difficult it is to deal with these kinds of regimes.
Yeah, there are no easy answers. But I think it's important to keep asking the questions.
Yeah.
And to keep the pressure on.
I agree. Because ultimately, it's the people of Eritrea who are suffering the most.
And we can't just forget about them.
Right.
We have to keep talking about this and keep trying to find solutions.
Exactly.
Man, this is heavy stuff. You know?
It really is. Eritrea is, it's a tough situation for sure.
It is. And, you know, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, talked about human rights abuses, regional instability, the whole North Korea comparison.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. So I guess for the listener, what's the takeaway here? Like, what's the one thing they should really remember about Eritrea?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the situation is complex.
Right.
There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
No quick fix.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the rhetoric, But the reality is Eritrea is a country with a long and complicated history, and its people are facing some really difficult challenges.
Yeah, and it's easy to feel helpless.
Yeah.
You know, like, what can one person do about a situation like this?
Yeah, I get that. But I think even just being aware of what's happening is a start, Educating yourself, talking about it with other people. That's how we start to build momentum for change.
So it's not just about pointing fingers and saying Eritrea is bad.
Right. It's about understanding the nuances, the history, the challenges, and trying to find ways to support the Eritrean people.
And maybe that's the biggest question we should leave the listener with. What role should the international community play in a situation like this?
It's a tough one, right? Because on the one hand, you have these really serious human rights abuses that can't be ignored. But on the other hand, intervention can also be really risky, and it can sometimes make things worse.
Yeah, it's like that whole the road to hell is paved with good intentions thing.
Exactly. So it's a delicate balance, and there's no easy answer.
So I guess it comes down to, what do we value more, stability or human rights?
And are those two things mutually exclusive? Can you have both?
Man, those are some deep questions.
They are, and there are no easy answers. But I think they're questions worth asking.
Absolutely. And, even if we don't have all the answers, I think this deep dive has at least given us a better understanding of the situation in Eritrea.
Yeah, I hope so. And hopefully it's inspired some people to learn more and to get involved.
Exactly. Because ultimately, the more people who are aware of what's happening, the better chance we have of making a difference.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. But thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of Eritrea.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. Because only through dialogue and understanding can we hope to find solutions to these global challenges.